Chulu Hills Reserve, late afternoon. The sun hung low over the ridgelines, casting long fingers of gold across the dry basin where the bush thinned into a clearing scattered with brittle grass and dust-darkened shrubs. There, standing unsteadily beneath the muted sky, was a juvenile elephant, alone, motionless but swaying, as if even gravity had grown uncertain around her. Her skin bore the dull gray of dehydration, flaked along the spine and stretched too tight around her ribs. And her ears hung slack without rhythm. The tip of her trunk dragged shallow patterns in the earth, leaving arcs that said nothing and ended nowhere. From a distance, she might have looked still enough to mistake for stone, if not for the slow, broken sound that rose from her chest. A soft, pulsing cry, hoarse and unfinished. It was not a trumpet, not a call, but a quiet, helpless vibration that seemed born more of instinct than hope. Ranger Amina, on patrol for signs of movement across the lower boundary, had not expected anything unusual. But silence carries weight differently when something is wrong, and in the bush it is not always the noise that signals alarm. It is the absence of birdsong, the halted rustle of insects, the way air settles too cleanly over the brush. She had turned the bend expecting the same patterned landscape, but instead found this calf, standing like a forgotten breath in the open light. She froze on instinct. Her boots stopped before her thoughts did. There was no herd, no dust clouds on the horizon, no cracked foliage, no rumbles, no shadows moving between acacias, nothing but the calf, fragile in posture, legs slightly bent outward to keep from collapsing. Amina lowered herself slowly into the brush, not to hide, but to make herself smaller, less disruptive. She watched the elephant without reaching for her radio at first, because she needed to be sure this was not temporary. Not the trailing edge of a herd still grazing nearby, but the calf did not glance toward distant sounds, did not shift with expectation. She simply remained, swaying, blinking, letting her body lean slightly forward until her weight would catch her and rock her back again. Only when the rhythm became clear, more resignation than alertness, did Amina speak into her radio with the softness of someone not wanting the moment to break. "Young female," she said, "alone, not aggressive, breathing shallow." Her voice remained steady, but the implication did not need explaining. In the wild, time is not measured in minutes but in thresholds. If this calf had been without her mother for more than a few hours in this heat, the risk was immediate. Dehydration in juveniles moves fast, slowing the heart, thickening the blood, pulling strength from the limbs first. If she fell now, her chances would begin to close before help could even arrive. From headquarters, the response was calm. Observe, mark the location, hold distance. Amina knew better than to approach. Shock could be as dangerous as neglect, but even as she knelt in the shade of low shrubs, eyes fixed on the calf's trembling sides, she felt the weight of urgency pressing beneath her ribs. The elephant's mouth opened slightly, not to eat, not to reach, but to breathe. Each inhale was audible, faint, strained, the kind that lifted the skin around her jaw but didn't expand her lungs fully. Her body was betraying her slowly, and she bore it with the kind of silence that unsettled even the wind. Amina adjusted her position without standing, letting her knee shift against the dry ground to ease a cramp forming from stillness. The calf didn't react. No ears twitched, no step backward, just a blink, long and slow. The kind that says not sleep, but fatigue. Around them, the reserve stood hushed, dust curling in thin lines across the clearing. Somewhere far off, the cry of a hornbill echoed and faded. The silence returned quickly. Amina scanned the slope one more time. Still no movement, no herd. It was possible they had been pushed off by predators or scattered during a stampede. But the longer the calf remained alone, the clearer it became. She had not been left. She had been lost. Her scent might have been masked by wind, her trail broken by cattle paths or erosion. Perhaps her mother had searched already and moved beyond the ridge. Or perhaps she hadn't made it. The risks were increasing, and the clock was now marked by the cadence of shallow breath and trembling knees. If the elephant collapsed, her lungs could fill with fluid, her circulation would fail, and she might not get back up. But if humans moved too soon, they risked pushing her into panic, burning the last of her energy on a desperate run. The best chance was stillness, distance, time. Amina glanced at the fading sun, gauging how much remained before shadows turned long enough to bring a drop in temperature. If they could wait that long, if the calf could remain upright just a little longer, the odds would soften. But nothing was certain. The elephant made another sound, soft, almost like a groan buried deep in her throat. She shifted one foot, then the other, as if attempting a step but thinking better of it. Her body sagged slightly to one side, then returned, and for a moment her eyes met Amina's, not fully, not knowingly, but long enough to register presence. It wasn't trust, it wasn't fear, it was simply contact, a silent acknowledgement that something else had entered the stillness. Amina whispered, almost without meaning to, "It's okay, girl." The words were lost in the distance, but the softness hung in the air. The elephant did not move. Her trunk curled weakly beneath her, dusted with dry earth, and her sides rose again, shallow, thin. The wind shifted gently across the clearing, rustling the brittle grass in slow waves. The horizon remained empty. The herd did not appear. Amina checked her watch, marked the coordinates again, and steadied her breath. If the calf held on, reinforcements would arrive within the hour. If not, if her legs failed, there would be no time for sedation or stretchers. Just reaction. Just hope. And so, under the lengthening light of a golden sky, Ranger and calf remained. The clearing caught between presence and collapse, between loss and rescue, between one breath and the next. Amina didn't speak as she rose to her feet, her eyes fixed on the faint marks leading away from the silent clearing, not wanting to disturb the fragile rhythm of what had been left behind in the soil. The calf hadn't moved much since collapsing, and the fading sun now painted long bands of shadow across her flanks, tracing the curve of her small, shivering body. With slow, measured steps, Amina moved through the brittle grass toward the trail, her boots pressing softly into the ground, avoiding the louder crunch of dead twigs. She scanned the dust for anything that might explain how this young elephant had ended up alone, swaying in exhaustion, her cries now reduced to faint exhalations. At first, the marks were scattered, confused. Small prints in shallow soil, splayed and uneven, moved in an arc along the edge of the scrub. Each footfall seemed slightly offset from the last, the spacing inconsistent, suggesting more of a stumble than a stride. Then, further out, the pattern became clearer, a single trail of juvenile-sized tracks heading south. Between the footprints, faint drag marks disturbed the upper crust of the earth, shallow but deliberate, as if a foot had occasionally given out and the calf had pulled herself forward with what strength she had left. Amina crouched, brushing two fingers along the pale indentations, feeling the broken dryness of the ground where weight had pressed down unevenly. The lines were not caused by a predator nor a vehicle. This was not a chase. This was the shape of exhaustion. Slow, stumbling, persistent. It told a quiet story of desperation, of one who had tried to follow but couldn't. She rose and walked slowly along the trail, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze low and steady, reading the ground like a memory unfolding. Just ahead, the path bent toward a thin depression in the land, the mouth of a dry riverbed. As she approached the edge, her boots scuffed across pale, cracked sediment, and there she saw them, 5 distinct sets of wide, deep adult elephant tracks pressed into the clay. Their stride was long, sure, uninterrupted, a straight path across the width of the riverbed, heading west. They hadn't paused. They hadn't veered. The herd had passed through here earlier in the day, hours ago, maybe less, and they'd been moving fast, likely toward safer grazing lands beyond the ridge. 50 meters behind those heavy prints, along the dusty curve where the land met the riverbed, the story changed. Smaller prints reappeared, pressed more deeply than before, and there, a single collapsed impression, a rounded body shape in the dirt, broken by the weight of stillness. The calf had lain there. For how long, Amina couldn't tell. The soil was slightly darker where her body heat had met the cool surface, and the fine layer of dust nearby remained undisturbed, windless. She could see the place where the calf had tried to rise, where her feet had dug short trenches in the dirt, pushing, slipping, failing. Then more drag marks, longer this time, carved across the ground toward the direction of the tracks, only to stop again at the river's edge. No prints beyond that, no return, just absence. Amina stood motionless for a long moment, the wind pulling lightly at the ends of her sleeves. In front of her was the truth. The calf had tried to follow the herd. She had collapsed once, gathered what little strength she had, and tried again. But she never made it across. Somewhere between the instinct to follow and the pain of weakness, she had fallen for the last time, and then turned back, alone. The herd had not returned, and they would not. It wasn't cruelty, Amina knew. In the wild, the survival of many often required the quiet loss of one. A sick calf could attract lions. Delaying for her could mean danger for the mothers and siblings. The cost of waiting was too high. Herds moved on, not out of indifference, but out of ancient necessity. Still, there was a weight to what had been left behind. Not an intention, but a consequence. And now, if they didn't act quickly, that consequence would end with death. Amina clicked her radio and relayed the position softly, giving exact bearings. She mentioned the herd tracks, the distance between the two locations, and her estimation that the calf had been alone for at least 5 hours. Her voice remained even, her words few. The vet team was en route moving in from the northeast. 20 minutes, perhaps less. But every passing second mattered. If the calf collapsed again before fluids arrived, her chances would narrow dangerously. If they lifted her too quickly, she could go into shock. If she panicked during transport, she might fall and not rise again. The risks were numerous, layered, real. The team would have to work slowly, speaking in low tones, offering water in stages, not rushing anything. Returning to the clearing, Amina moved faster now, retracing the trail she had followed. The light was fading, dusk pulling a purple hue across the ridgeline. The calf had shifted, her front legs curled beneath her, breathing shallow but steady. Her ears barely flicked at Amina's approach. No protest, no sound, only the rising and falling of her flank. Amina knelt at a short distance, removing the cap from her canteen, pouring a few drops into her palm. She didn't move closer yet, just let the scent of moisture settle into the air. The calf's head lifted slightly. One eye, dull but open, blinked once. Then stillness returned. "It's okay, girl," Amina whispered, her voice barely above the wind. The moment didn't ask for more than that. And, in the distance, the dry riverbed remained silent, the herd long gone, the trail between them left behind like a story no one had meant to write, only endure. The hum of the approaching vehicle was muffled by the thick stillness of early dusk, where even the insects had quieted and the wind drifted gently over brittle leaves. Amina remained beside the calf without touching her, her body still and her hands resting loosely on her thighs. She had said nothing else since the whispered reassurance, but the moment didn't ask for more. When the vet team finally arrived, they moved with the kind of deliberate quiet that comes from experience. Not rushing, not announcing. Dr. Kamau stepped out first, his worn kit slung across one shoulder, boots pressing into the same dry ground that still held the fading indentations of the calf's final effort to follow her herd. He approached slowly, pausing a few feet away to observe before kneeling. The calf remained collapsed, Her breathing shallow but present, her eyes only half-lidded now. He scanned her body without speaking, noting the loose skin along her flanks, the slow return of color when he pressed against her ear, the faint tremor in her limbs each time she exhaled. There were no visible wounds, no fractures, no swelling along the joints. Her trunk was dry, coiled weakly beside her. Her mouth, cracked at the corners, hadn't moved in over an hour. Dehydration was clear, severe, prolonged. But something else lingered beneath the surface. The slight tightness in her belly, the faint heat around her lower abdomen. Infection was possible. Internal, maybe. Amina kept her focus on the vet, waiting, not asking. Kamau finally leaned back on his heels and gave a small nod toward his assistant, who moved to the truck for fluids. "She's critical," he said quietly, "but stable enough for field hydration." Amina didn't answer. She already knew what came next, wasn't certain. Administering treatment here, slow hydration, careful observation, gentle stimulation, would keep her on familiar ground, less stress, lower risk of collapse from transport shock. But it would mean delaying antibiotics, delaying full diagnostic scans, delaying intensive care she might need within hours. The other option, loading her onto the vehicle, supporting her body with padding, securing the trunk to prevent thrashing, came with its own set of dangers. The stress alone could shut her system down. Her muscles were weak, her blood pressure unstable. One jolt on the road, one loud sound, one failed lift, and the effort would be lost. Kamau looked to Amina, his face calm but weighted. He didn't say the risk out loud. She understood it. Her eyes drifted toward the calf's small foot, where dust clung to the curled edge of her toes. No movement, no resistance. But she was breathing, still holding on. The assistant returned. Saline bag already connected to a slow-release IV. Kamau cleaned the fold behind the calf's ear and inserted the needle gently, taping it down with slow fingers. The drip began its rhythm. 1 drop, 2, 3. Amina finally exhaled. They would try here first. Keep her grounded, monitor the response, and if no change came in the next hour, they would move. Carefully, quietly. By then, the sun had dropped below the ridgeline, turning the dust gold and the trees black in silhouette. The light fell across the clearing like soft breath, touching the calf's back, the glint of the IV tube, the worn edge of Amina's boot. The calf blinked once, slowly, and her ears shifted just enough to lift a whisper of air. Nothing more. But it was something. Just enough to continue. The air held its breath in that hour between dusk and dark, where sounds thinned and shadows deepened but never fully disappeared. The drip from the IV line continued its soft, metered rhythm, steady as a heartbeat against the stillness that had gathered around the small circle of humans and the lone calf. Her body had not moved in some time. The folds of her skin, now dampened along the flank with cooled saline, had begun to regain a faint tension, but her limbs remained slack and her trunk was coiled in quiet surrender beside her jaw. There were no calls, no distressed motions, no desperate search for something lost, only the fragile silence that came when all energy had been spent. Amina had remained seated beside her throughout the hydration, not touching, only watching. Watching the rise and fall of breath, watching the slow blink of lashes, watching the tremor of life that had not yet given way. At one point she shifted her weight forward and laid her palm gently on the calf's side, fingers splayed across the ridge of ribs. The contact was calm, her hand still. Beneath it, she could feel the faint echo of breath, a shallow expansion, the pull of air. Then rest. The calf did not startle, did not stir. For a long stretch of moments there was no change, and then, from beneath the curve of a dust-flecked ear, there came a flick. Just once, deliberate, weak, but present. Amina blinked slowly, then left her hand in place, not pressing, not urging. The vet noticed but said nothing. There was no celebration, no misreading of a sign. It was only what it was, a physiological response. Yet still it mattered. The flick meant the calf was aware, still within herself, still connected enough to respond to touch. It was the first outward sign that her body was not withdrawing entirely. As night began to gather at the edges of the clearing, the team checked the saline levels again. Enough had been delivered to rehydrate her for now, and the rest would follow slowly through the night. Transport was still not advisable. The risks remained the same. Sudden movement could destabilize her fragile condition. They would stay here, monitor. Let her rest. Let her decide. No one spoke more than needed. When the name came, it was spoken softly, almost beneath breath. Nia. Amina said it once, a whisper not meant for confirmation but release. It meant purpose in Swahili. It was not given in hope of her survival. It was given to recognize what already existed, whether her strength held or not. She had tried to follow, had dragged her body across earth hardened by sun, had stood, alone in the open, had cried, then fallen. And still she had breathed. That, in itself, carried weight. They would call her Nia, not because they needed her to live, but because she had mattered from the moment she was found. As the moon began to rise, the wind shifted and moved softly through the acacia leaves. The IV line caught the light like a thread of silver stretched between will and waiting. Amina leaned back slightly, her hand now resting beside the calf's shoulder in the dust. The calf's breathing remained unchanged, but it was steady. In the stillness, the world did not expect more. It only waited. Quietly. The first light came slow, drawing its fingers through the grass like someone waking something gently, not wanting to startle what had barely held on through the night. The clearing, once gripped by a hush born of tension, softened under the pale blue hush of morning. Dew clung to the edges of brush and thorn, glinting faintly before surrendering to the warming air. The IV bag hung nearly drained, its line slackening with each drop as hydration settled into the calf's tissues. Her form remained still, but the lines of her body had changed. No longer collapsed in desperation, but stretched long in recovery, ribs rising and falling in steady measure. Amina had not slept. She had remained close by, shoulders drawn but quiet, watching over the calf with the same resolve she had shown from the moment they found her, an unspoken vow that she would not be left alone again. Not while it could be helped. As the sky warmed into a canvas of gentle peach, a sound stirred. It did not come from the camp or from the known edges of the reserve. It moved through the air, low and rhythmic, a rolling vibration that seemed to swell and fade in equal turns, like breath passed between distant hills. Amina turned her head toward it instinctively but did not rise. She waited, listened. Another rumble came, then a second, then silence. No immediate answer, no clear direction. But something in the tone did not belong to trucks or weather. It was deeper, older, something that moved in chest and soil more than ear. Just as she began to doubt herself, she saw it. A flutter, barely visible. The calf's left ear gave a small, deliberate twitch. A response, not a reflex. Amina held still, her breath quieting further. Then again, another soft flick, this time paired with the faint lift of the calf's brow ridge, as if trying to find the source without opening her eyes. That one gesture shifted everything. It meant that the calf not only heard, but recognized. Somewhere in the distance, something was calling, something familiar enough to trigger memory or instinct, and in that recognition was the return of a possibility. The vet, now quietly packing equipment on the edge of the field, paused as well. His eyes met Amina's briefly, not with hope or certainty, but shared awareness of change. What lay at risk had not diminished. The calf was not out of danger. Her hydration was stable, but temporary. If infection had begun, it could spread silently and undo what had been fought for all night. Her strength, though returning in inches, was not yet enough for transport or prolonged standing, and the herd, if it was a herd, was still only sound. They could be far, they could be unrelated, but if there was a chance that her mother was among them, it meant the calf's isolation was no longer a fixed condition. It meant they had to prepare. Whether to move her closer to the noise, or to wait and call out, or to mark her scent in the grass, they would need to choose soon. But for now, they watched her listening, watched the grass shift slightly as the wind passed through, pulling the rumble with it. It wasn't a promise, just a chance. And in the soft quiet of dawn, that was enough. The air had shifted by mid-morning, trading the muted softness of dawn for a clearer, drier heat that shimmered gently above the ground. The quiet had returned, not as absence, but as a kind of reverence, each movement stilled as if something unspoken was unfolding beneath it all. Amina stood a few paces away from where Nia rested, her hands folded loosely, watching the calf's sides rise and fall in a rhythm steadier than before, yet still hesitant. The fluids had done their work, stabilizing the delicate thread that tied her to life. But it was something else now that stirred the silence. A call that had passed earlier in the wind had not faded. It had thickened, pressed inward, pulling tension into the space like invisible thread. When the shape appeared along the ridge, no one moved at first. Not even the birds disturbed the branches above. The figure stood tall and alone, a matriarch, her ears fanned wide, trunk low but still, gaze fixed across the clearing where Nia lay. She didn't descend. She didn't trumpet. She only watched. Amina exhaled once, quietly, and the vet, still crouched near the cooler of supplies, rose and slowly stepped back. The brush between them and the ridge swayed softly in the breeze, casting broken shadows on the dry earth below. The calf did not lift her head at first, but her ears angled sharply, drawn toward that presence. Then, after a pause that felt longer than the minutes it held, she shifted. It began with a twitch of her flank, then a stretch of her forelegs. There was a pause, then, trembling and slow, the rear legs tucked under, muscles weak but willing. Her weight rocked, and with a low grunt of effort, Nia began to rise. Not fully upright, not yet, but enough to push herself into a half-standing crouch, her limbs wobbling, her head unsteady. She paused like that, breathing hard. From the ridge, the older elephant did not flinch. She remained motionless, but alert, still watching. Not yet approaching, not yet certain. What lay between them was not distance. It was time, scent, memory, and the fragility of what might be recognition. The moment was taut. Nia took one step forward, then collapsed again. Not in failure, but fatigue. Her legs gave with the soft thud of surrender, but her body did not fold the way it had hours before. This time there was control, not collapse. Amina did not move. No one rushed in. They knew enough to wait, to let instinct, if it was awakening, play its course without human interruption. The matriarch's trunk rose slightly, sampling the air. Still no movement forward. But she hadn't turned away. For the calf, every second upright had taken strength that weeks of malnourishment had stripped. What remained now was the possibility that she had been heard and seen. The risks were unchanged. Nia remained at the edge of exhaustion, her internal condition unknown. The older elephant might not approach, might not recognize, might even reject. But something had changed. In the soft standoff between ridge and plain, in the motionless breath held by all, there was the shape of something ancient, a test not of courage, but of belonging. The grass swayed again, a breeze passed low, and the matriarch did not leave. The wind had settled into something steady now, brushing through the trees and combing gently across the dust as if smoothing out the creases of what had just been. The matriarch still hadn't moved from the ridge, her form a silhouette of patience and weight. Below her, the ground shimmered with heat. But it was not the sun that drew the attention of those present. It was the calf, Nia, whose breath now came more steadily, though her body still bore the tremble of spent effort. Amina remained at a careful distance, crouched low beside the vet, her voice stilled not by fear but by reverence. Nia stirred again. Her limbs quivered beneath her weight as she attempted to rise once more, this time with a fewer spasms of doubt. Her front legs lifted her chest from the earth first. Then came the unsteady rocking as her hindquarters followed, hooves pressing into dry soil. Her stance, once folded and uncertain, stretched taller, uncoiled, but not fully sure. For a long second she wobbled in place, her knees dipping slightly, muscles strained thin from dehydration and trauma. But she did not fall. A low gust passed over the plain, catching the loose hairs along her spine. She took a single, small step, then another, each one clumsy, wide-legged, uncertain. But they carried her forward, toward the ridge, toward the still figure who had waited without demand. The space between them was not great in distance, but it was layered in instinct and silence. Nia's ears flicked forward, and her trunk, still not fully coordinated, raised briefly before falling again. Her pace was slow, deliberate, not because of confusion, but because her legs remembered what her body still feared. Every footfall raised a tiny puff of dust. The older elephant did not step forward. She simply remained, trunk lowered, ears half-flared. From the human's vantage, it was impossible to know whether this was a reunion or a test. All that was certain was that movement had returned, that the calf, once lifeless in the heat, now walked under her own strength. At 20 feet apart, Nia paused. Her sides heaved, her eyes not quite focused. A small grunt pushed from her chest. Then movement from the matriarch. A step. One large, grounding step forward, then another. No sound, no call, just nearness. The two stood that way, close but not touching, the space between them tense with history neither human could interpret. Nia's trunk extended part way, then dropped. The matriarch responded in kind, a slow, silent motion, as if allowing scent to speak what her body would not. For a moment neither moved again, and then, almost imperceptibly, the matriarch lowered her head just slightly, an allowance. Not full embrace. Not complete acceptance. But something softened, and Nia moved forward into it. The contact was brief, just a brushing of flanks, a shared breath between old and young, but it was enough. From the edge of the clearing, Amina exhaled gently, her hands still clasped, unmoving. The vet beside her didn't speak. They both understood the risk remained. Nia's body was weak, the infection still latent. But survival, for the moment, had stepped closer. The sky above had cleared completely now. And in the silence between breaths, there was nothing left to do but watch as something old as the land itself unfolded without permission. The wind passed again, and the grass bent with it. The wind had begun to soften over Chulu Hills as late afternoon edged into the stillness of early evening, brushing low through the acacia branches and settling the dust along narrow game paths that cut across the reserve. Amina crouched near the tree line, her boots pressing lightly into the soil, binoculars resting loosely in her hands, but her focus never left the motionless figure just beyond the clearing. The young elephant calf had not moved in minutes. She was upright when Amina first arrived, swaying gently on her feet, but the sway had since stopped, and now there was only stillness. A silence broken only by the soft scuff of leaves and the distant hum of cicadas. Then, as if her legs simply gave out, the calf slowly collapsed forward, folding at the knees in a way that looked almost too practiced, too quiet to be accidental. Her body landed with a soft thud in the dust, trunk trailing beside her, ears slack against her cheeks. It wasn't the kind of fall that spoke of pain or panic. It was the fall of exhaustion, an animal running out of strength. Amina's hand hovered over her radio but didn't press it yet. She waited, watching carefully, measuring the heaving of the elephant's ribs, the flicker, or lack of it, in her ears, the faint twitch of her tail. None came, just the subtle lift and drop of shallow breathing. Dust clung to the folds of the calf's skin, already dry and wrinkled despite her youth. Her eyelids, heavy and half-closed, barely moved. No sounds came from her mouth now. No more of those low, confused cries that had brought Amina here in the first place. That silence wasn't comforting. It was warning. For a moment longer, Amina just observed. Then, with deliberate calm, she clicked the radio and spoke quietly into the receiver, her tone stripped to its essentials. Single juvenile, down, no lacerations or visible injury, collapse due to suspected dehydration, urgent response needed. A pause. Static. Then the soft voice of the vet unit confirmed they were on their way. But they were coming from base, nearly 40 kilometers out. ETA. 45 minutes, maybe more. Amina's jaw tightened, not in frustration, but calculation. Every minute mattered. Lying down for too long was dangerous for elephants, the weight of their bodies pressing against their own organs, the risk of compromised breathing, of blood flow slowing to the brain and lungs. And for a calf with no herd, no shade, and no visible water source nearby, the risk was more than clinical. It was absolute. If she slipped into unconsciousness here, she might not come back. But Amina didn't move. Protocol demanded distance until the animal either rose or the medical team arrived. Approaching too soon could induce panic, and panic, in a calf this weak, could kill. She remained behind the log, knees bent, breath measured, hands resting against the cool bark beneath her gloves. Her eyes never left the calf. The elephant's sides rose slowly, then paused. 6 seconds, then 8. When the breath returned, it was shallow, barely visible. A fine tremble passed through the calf's flank. Not a shiver, but a sign that her body was beginning to reach its limit. No herd had answered her cries. No adult presence had emerged from the trees. If she had been abandoned, or orphaned, which was more likely, then there would be no mother to coax her forward, no sisters to shield her from sun or wind. She was alone, and too young to survive that way for long. A soft gust passed over the grass, lifting the edge of a leaf near the calf's forehead. The elephant didn't react. No twitch, no flick, not even a blink. That stillness, more than anything, began to press at Amina's chest. She whispered, barely audible, "Just hold on." Not because she believed the animal understood, but because the silence felt too heavy without something to fill it. And for a moment, her voice seemed to hang in the air, caught in the space between witness and will. The elephant didn't stir. Behind her, the clouds had begun to thicken, casting a pale violet tint over the hilltops. The horizon faded into haze. Distant birds called across the valley. But their voices were muted now, like the land itself was holding its breath. Amina lowered her binoculars and scanned the edges of the clearing again. Not for threats, but for clues. Broken branches, disturbed soil, dung patterns. Nothing fresh, no movement, no sign of another elephant for hours. She exhaled through her nose. The calf had likely been alone since morning, maybe longer. If she hadn't nursed recently, her energy stores would be dangerously low. Dehydration would have begun to affect organ function, circulation, even cognition. If she remained down much longer, the odds would turn rapidly against her. And yet, there was still a rhythm to her breath. Weak, but present. Amina began preparing mentally for options. If the calf tried to stand and failed, she would have to radio for sedation support. Risky in young elephants. If the vet team didn't arrive in time, there was no backup unit within 20 kilometers. And if they lost her here, in the open, without trauma or predation, it would be from something far more silent. Depletion. Pure and simple. Her fingers tightened slightly around the radio. Ready. But nothing changed. The elephant remained still, breathing, fading, a body in quiet surrender. Somewhere behind her, a breeze rustled through the leaves. The light shifted again. Another moment passed, heavy with waiting, and still, the calf lay in the dust, motionless, suspended in the narrow space between holding on and letting go.